My primary contribution to this event today was in answering Adam's question of, shouldn't there be someone from the industry to talk about regulation? And I'm pleased to say, mine, for me, was Richard Anderson. Richard has a long, very distinguished history in the aviation industry. I first met him when he was at Northwest, but he had experience before that. And then he moved to Delta and was the chief executive at both of those airlines. And as a result, he has experienced with all the adjustments of the industry in the last 30 years. That was benefit 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Benefit number 5 is that for reasons that are known only to him, he left the industry and accepted the job as chief executive of Amtrak. And as a result, we can ask him questions without his worrying about the effect on Delta stock. And so without further ado, Richard Anderson.
Thanks, Josh. Well, it's a privilege to be here today, and if I were going to acknowledge someone in my remarks, it would be Mike Levine. So I had the good and distinct pleasure of working for Mike, being the brunt of Mike's anger from time to time, but also had the opportunity to learn a lot from him about deregulation. I mean, I started in the industry in 1987. From the criminal courts building in Houston, Texas, to the Continental headquarters just west of downtown. In there, I met Mike and Ben Hurst and Phil Bakes and Barry Simon and Frank Lorenzo, a lot of players that had a significant role in the deregulated world. So by all measures, I agree with Dorothy. I mean, I think it may have some messy aspects, but by all measures, deregulation has been a real success. And if you think about the industrial organization, we've evolved to 4 large U.S. carriers, 2 strong national carriers, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, and 4 low-fare, no-frills, low-cost carriers with Spirit, Frontier, Allegiant, and Sun Country. Domestic fares, if you just look at the data, and you were kind enough to go, the institution was kind enough to go do research for me, and because we just track trains at Amtrak, we don't. I should say that I'm going to be very objective about what I say. I have no affiliation at all with Delta, and haven't for a couple of years. And even though I, in essence, report to Amtrak, I am not paid at Amtrak, so I'm an unpaid volunteer at Amtrak. So I sort of approached this and only did it because I could be pretty unabashed. So fares, sort of domestic airfares, and you've got to be careful about fare data. Averages are what they are. They're averages, and a lot of times they don't always fully tell a complete story, but down about 46%. And if you looked at open skies markets internationally, basically I think it's more than what Dr. Winston discovered. I actually think that you'll find in open skies markets that you're going to go to probably 50% at the deep discounted end of the fare spectrum, particularly given that international travel for leisure travelers is much more advanced purchase, right? People tend to really plan out ahead of time. So if you look at the purposes behind the Deregulation Act, the first was the maintenance of safety as the highest priority. And I would offer that the industry has gotten much more safer as a result of deregulation. And a little bit of anecdote and a little bit of data. If we go back and look at the data, in 1960, there were 31 fatal accidents per 10 million departures. So pretty high number. And if you go from 1960 through deregulation in 1980, really full deregulation in 82, you see a precipitous decline. And part of this is that and Dr. Rose was right, these are consumer companies. This is a business to consumer company. If you are not safe, you are out of business. And if you look back in the late 80s and 90s, 3 carriers had kind of a tough go of it. I was working at one of them, Continental. We had a couple of accidents. Delta had a series of accidents, and US Air had a series of accidents. And it basically takes your business away. So at a core, the core product in a deregulated market, first and foremost, is safe operations. And the industry actually evolved significantly with flight operations quality assurance programs, aviation safety action programs, and then in the last 3 or 4 years, the SMS programs. The value jet accident resulted in, because one of the big shifts that occurred in aviation was airframe maintenance has essentially been completely outsourced now. In 1978, carriers maintained their own airframes. Now most all wide bodies are done in Singapore or Hong Kong or China, and narrow bodies are done south of the border. But what happened was our regulatory regime didn't keep up with a substantial maintenance provider, which is a set of regulations that came out after the value jet accident. So I would submit that actually in a consumer business, and you're seeing the tech companies go through this right now, you can't lose the confidence of your customers. And I would actually argue that if you looked at the data and how the industry has evolved with SMS programs and a just culture approach, deregulation has actually done a really good job of compelling investment where it should be, which is in making the operations safer. If we keep moving, slightly different view than the panelists on infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is actually a huge number. If you looked at the 30 largest hub airports in the U.S. since 2008, over $120 billion of investment has either been put in the ground or in terminals or is planned. Let's just go down. Seattle added another runway and right now is rebuilding its international terminal. Los Angeles is going through a complete revamp of all of its terminals and building a second addition to the Tom Bradley terminal. Salt Lake City is demolishing its entire terminal and building a $2 billion new terminal facility. I can keep going down the list. We added Denver Stapleton Airport. It's going through a huge rehab right now. Minneapolis, we did $1.8 billion. In 1995, we adopted the 2010 plan and put almost $2 billion, including a new runway and completely rebuilding all the terminals and building an LLC terminal. Because at Northwest, we never had enough gate capacity in the Lindbergh terminal. We supported the construction of the Humphrey terminal, which is now where Southwest, Spirit, and all those carriers have their own terminal. You can go around the United States and you can pick whatever airport. Miami, while it may have taken 20 years, they did completely rebuild the facility. Washington National got rebuilt. Atlanta, before I retired, I signed a $6 billion 20-year commitment to add a 6th parallel runway, had already built a 5th. And if you look around the U.S., that's probably the one area of infrastructure that's funded. The main constraint that you suffer in infrastructure in the country is in the Northeast Corridor. And that's because we're not going to put a runway in the Potomac, and no congressman wants to drive to Dulles. We found that out after 9/11, right? What airport got closed and opened really fast? Because if you think about a 180-degree turn at 500 feet over onto a short runway, there's a lot of accommodation that's made here, right? But we're not going to pour. Newark is a one-runway operation. LaGuardia really is a one-runway operation. Teterboro interferes with both of them. Philly is nearby. We have a location and congestion problem in the Northeast that tends to cascade to the rest of the industry. But I would submit, if you just looked at the data from AAA and the individual airports, there's been a massive bolus of investment in airports in the United States. And the investment has been in the favor of the consumer, because what we've done is put really high-end restaurants and high-end facilities all over the United States and moved the food off the airplane into good restaurants at airports. If we keep moving through the other indicators of, Dr. Rose had a good stat on this, 1978, there were 275 million in plane passengers. 2033, we're projecting the most recent FAA forecast, 1.2 billion in plane passengers. So tremendous growth and tremendous demand. Product. Now, this is interesting. I tended to do things based on data, and probably the best indication of sort of looking at how consumers view the industry is, one, the tremendous growth in employments. But number two, let's look at J.D. Power data. They do the most statistically significant and comprehensive surveys of passenger satisfaction. In 2006, the J.D. Power survey, it's 1 to 800, 800 being perfect. We were at 692 all in U.S. airline industry, and in 2018, the number was 762. So the last decade or so have allowed carriers to pour enormous amounts of investment into new airplanes, entertainment on airplanes, clubs, technology, because there is a real battle that goes on in the marketplace around customers. And I can just tell you, as a one-time competitor, the marketplace decides if you pull somebody off of an airplane against their will, whether you're going to still have as high a unit revenue or sell as many tickets. And so the marketplace might be a little bit messy, but there's a lot of variety out there. Southwest won't let Expedia have any of their data. You've got to go to southwest.com. JetBlue has more room. American Airlines tried more room in coach in the early 2000s. They took tens of thousands of seats off their airplanes on the theory that they would be able to take market share. They took no market share. They couldn't get paid for that because consumers tell you what they want to get paid for. And how pricing has evolved is evolved the same way that all consumer pricing in America has evolved. iPhone is now out with a low discount model. Marriott has Courtyard, JW Marriott, and the St. Regis. The challenge you have in an airline is consumer segmentation has to happen on the same piece of real estate. So the segmentation piece gets more difficult. But the marketplace is going to decide whether United Airlines is penalized for how it treats its passengers or pets, whatever the subject is. And of all the industries, the airline industry seems to get covered more than just about any other industry. So there's great information in the marketplace for good carriers. I can just tell you that my view always was, even back long ago, is that you're flying to the same airports in an airplane made by either Airbus or Boeing. So if you wanted to win in the marketplace, you had to distinguish yourself with your customers, and you had to win in the marketplace. So let's talk about what deregulation brought. First, the hub and spoke system. Actually, the airlines did not invent the hub and spoke system. The hub and spoke system was invented by railroads, and before railroads, by shipping companies. So the notion that you would get indivisibilities, which is something I learned from Mike Levine, that, the airplane that was going from Minot, North Dakota to Minneapolis carried every passenger that was going to Amsterdam, London, Fort Myers, and Oklahoma City. They all got on one airplane in Minot or Fargo. And those indivisibilities are what make hub airports so efficient. So hub and spoke, both domestically and internationally, have made a really big difference. And I give one anecdote there. I did get to know Mr. Nyrop, who was sort of legendary at Northwest. It was the one carrier that was always financially successful. And I got to know him, and I got to know Mr. Garrett. And they were both regulated era CEOs, and they both independently at different points in time told me that when the industry got deregulated, they didn't know what to do, that they had spent all their time in a world of the CAB setting rates, routes, and services, and didn't really know how to evolve to a new world of free entry and free exit. And what hub and spoke did, maybe not to a perfect extent, but hub and spoke really made one stop competitive with nonstops. And carriers act, those activities in the marketplace have some product or a significant amount of product substitutability. And that's what the hub versus the linear route system gave the marketplace. So that the one stop has product substitutability with the nonstop in many, many markets and acts as a pricing discipline in the marketplace. International antitrust immunity, I was fortunate to be involved in that. You'll notice that the first Open Skies agreement was between the United States and Netherlands. That was because KLM, and actually the technical foreign ownership is 25% voting control, but 49% total equity. So KLM had 25% voting control, 3 board seats, and had a preferred equity in Northwest. At that time, Northwest flew, I think we had 4 DC-10s worth of flying to Europe. And they were DC-1040s, even worse. And so KLM made this big investment in Northwest. What were you going to get for your $500 million? And we came up with the very first code-share flight under Open Skies, 3 days a week, a KLM combi, between Minneapolis and Amsterdam. We had half the airplane on a block space agreement. They had half. And we started it, and it connected in Amsterdam, and pretty soon it just started growing like wildfire. Before we were done, about 7 years later, we were flying 5 a day, Detroit, Amsterdam, and 4 a day, Minneapolis, Amsterdam, connecting the two hubs. And it's funny how an unregulated market, you have those kinds of discoveries. I mean, we didn't, we got the first antitrust immunity with the Dutch, and we had really no network at all at Northwest. And that was at a time when American and United were opposed to alliances. You may not remember that, but there was a time when they were opposed to the Northwest KLM alliance. And United would come to meetings in Detroit and Minneapolis to try to block our ability to build our FIS facilities directly in the center of our domestic operation, because you wanted to have minimum connect times of less than 90 minutes on both the U.S. side and the European side. The application of technology, particularly RM, revenue management, has been really significant, and those systems grow in complexity every day. Frequent flyer programs, credit card agreements. Dr. Rose has documented this in several of her writings that you can link to on the Brookings Institution webpage. There have been a lot of other innovations, but let me move on to the future really quick. One, there's a lot going on in technology, to Dorothy's point, and I agree with Dorothy. There was one really significant purchase by Google that probably escaped everyone, and that was ITA. So ITA was started by Northwest, United, and American when we started Orbitz. So Orbitz was started by the U.S. carriers. And Jeff Katz was the CEO, and we funded the MIT professors that built the ITA search engine. It sold to Google for $700 million. I wanted to buy it. Just be clear. I wanted to buy it, but we didn't have two nickels to rub together at the time. So the point of it is there's going to be a lot of innovation. And by the way, CRSs are still quite relevant. CRSs still are the engine. The IBM TPF mainframe is still the engine behind all the reservations you make on Expedia or anywhere else. I do believe there should be very clear transparency rules. And that's not just for airlines. That ought to be for Apple and Facebook and Google and Amtrak and Dell computers. Consumers do need good, clear information about what they're buying. And I think DOT has done some good rulemaking in that regard. But with that said, I don't think that the government should mandate content for Google. Google has everybody's content today because ITA is the search engine behind most websites, not Expedia, but airline websites. And in order to get their technology, you're forced to license all your data to them. And they're in a search war right now to be the first on a web page, just like Apollo and Sabre did the architectural bias that led to the CRS rules in '92. Same fights going on right now. And I just think that there will be different technology players and that the government shouldn't come in and mandate that every Silicon Valley startup that wants to get into airline distribution has the right to all your content. That doesn't mean that carriers shouldn't be completely transparent, to Nancy's point, Kathy's point. I actually think that gets back to a consumer attribute. You're not going to be a trusted partner to your corporate partners and your consumer partners if you're not fully transparent and completely clear about, and look, I'm doing that today at Amtrak. I mean, we're putting a lot of investment in right now at Amtrak to put everything on mobile apps so that when you get on the Acela and there's a delay at Bowie because of a trespasser crossing, you're going to know exactly what's going on the railroad. So I think that is really important to let all this technology evolve. And you have Southwest that won't let anyone have any of their data ever. And then you've got, the big carriers that distribute an enormous amount of their product through these third-party sites. But they do it through an arm's length negotiation. International bilaterals, obviously I was fairly controversial about a lot of these, and I'll just give you, maybe some of you would criticize it as a bit myopic, but when we went into the open skies policy in 91, 92, and we were involved in that very first one with the Netherlands, the idea is that you were going to open the skies and you were going to have these equal commercial relationships. You have to understand that a lot of our bilateral partners do not view it that way. They're flag carriers, and in Asia, there's only one non-government carrier, and that's Cathay. Pretty much all the rest are either government-owned or government-occupied, and they're arms of a broader economic policy in these countries, whether it's Chaiban in Korea or the state-owned carriers in China or Japan Airlines and All Nippon Airways. These are all arms of a broader economic policy, and candidly, we do not do a very good job in those negotiations. So I'll just use two negotiations that were really big. One was, quote, open skies to Japan, where we ended up in a route case fighting over 4 frequencies in the middle of the night. Normally, that's not open skies. But we called it open skies, but we didn't get much out of that deal. we pretty much, they had, Japan Airlines and All Nippon Airways had open access to wherever they wanted to fly, whenever they wanted to fly in the U.S. But the U.S. carriers didn't get that. And then the second one I'd make reference to is London and getting into Heathrow. Carriers like Northwest, if you weren't TWA and Pan Am, you had to go to Gatwick for decades and decades and decades. Then we get a, quote, open skies agreement, and a slot's $100 million, and you can't find any of them at Heathrow. Now, eventually, we figured out ways through alliance partners. So the way most carriers that weren't a Pan Am or TWA descendant, that's United and American, the way you got in was through alliance partners. We got in through KLM and Air France because they had slots. So the point of it is, I'd use those two examples that I don't think that our intentions in bilaterals are the same as what our counterparties are. And I think we proved in the Middle East carrier case beyond any doubt that they were in violation of the clauses in our treaties. But you ended up in this kind of what I'll call a regulatory soup where you've got acknowledgement that there were violations of the bilateral, but, oh, you're making enough money. Really? That's what our regulatory policy is going to be? Oh, yeah, there's probably some violations there of the stated terms of the bilateral when we had proof of it, certified financial statements that we found in Singapore. Our government didn't find them. We found them. But, oh, it's okay, even though the sort of the face of the bilateral was in violations. Big other trends that are out there, and then we'll be right here into the Q&A. What's happened because we don't have foreign ownership is you have ATI and open skies. I think ATI and open skies have provided a lot of benefits. And continue to provide a lot of benefits because I got to tell you, it's really hard to connect traffic in a hub in the U.S. and in a hub to a foreign carrier in another country. It's just hard, and it's hard, and I could put on a full day seminar on why it's so hard, and trying to get a consistent product. But what the alliances allow you to do is make really big technology investments that allow the smooth transit of passengers and baggage around the world across networks. And it's hard to do because everybody has a different reservation system, an airport control system, a flight dispatch system. I think the 1,500-hour rule that got passed in the wake of the Buffalo accident is causing an undue constraint on pilots. I think it was a terrible accident. I would note that the two pilots that were involved in that terrible accident had over 5,000 hours apiece, and it had to do with qualification and training and checking and the other sorts of things that a good operator will undertake, but that we're going to really constrain demand for pilots. I think that the major airlines, all four of them, including Southwest, are taking on too much debt, and I think their costs are rising rapidly. And there will ultimately be some sort of reconciliation of that in the marketplace. You just saw that Southwest expressed disappointment in its failure to sort of remain a low-cost carrier. And we see this trend. My personal view is these businesses don't like leverage. You know, leverage is hard in a business. But I guess I probably spent so much time, my time in the industry, trying to make payroll that I just don't like leverage. I don't think that these assets, that it's a good trade to buy back stock with debt. And, I think that carriers are rightly investing a lot in their products and their fleets. And you'll remember that one of the purposes of deregulation was to have carriers that have a good return on capital and that are efficient and well run. I think that there are going to be some challenges as cost basis grows and leverage grows in this industry. I think the real challenge in the network is in the Pacific, that over the long run, it's very difficult for a U.S. carrier to have a return on capital in the Pacific because it takes 2 airplanes. Wide body airplane with all the discounts and everything's about $150 million. So it takes 2 of those because they don't fly fast enough. And, you know, when you, at Northwest, when we ran our network, our hub in Tokyo, Fugu, you know, all of our airplanes crossed over the Aleutians. Everybody, you know, all the 747s that were coming back to the U.S. crossed the ones that were heading to Asia because you can't do it in 24 hours. So it takes $250 million of capital to do a daily nonstop to an Asian country. And you see a lot of entry and exit in a lot of these markets because the carriers on the other end tend to be government owned and government subsidized. So they're not going to be as focused on a return. And you've seen that happen in India with the Middle East carriers. The U.S. has essentially exited India, and India has no viable carriers, you know, Indian flag carriers. I think that rural areas have lost out in deregulation a bit. If you look at the number of regional airplanes in the U.S. and the BTS data at DOT, those numbers have been declining on a pretty steady basis. A whole lot of the EAS piece of it didn't work. It's one of the things we're trying to work on at Amtrak is, you know, how can our national network provide much more support to rural America because, you know, demographics have changed in our country and people have moved to the cities, but we shouldn't forget about rural areas. And the EAS, many of the EAS markets are no longer served. Look, I shut down 28 EAS markets in the Northwest Delta system because of the losses were just staggering. And the load factors were in the 40s on 34-seat airplanes. So you were on average carrying 15 or 16 people. I think the consolidation of the OEMs is one that's going to ultimately translate into higher costs to consumers. So if you look at the single biggest increasing cost in the industry, it's the OEMs. It's BF Goodrich, General Electric, Rolls, Pratt & Whitney. It's been sort of untouched from a regulatory perspective. They use IP and intellectual property to erect very high barriers at a time when additive manufacturing should be taking down costs. And so it's one area that's never been looked at. Actually, it's always been, I had an antitrust regulator tell me one time that when I was opposed to the Boeing-Douglas merger. I was always a big fan of Douglas airplanes. But I was essentially told that when it comes to Department of Defense, they kind of get to do their own thing. But fortunately, Airbus has grown up in the midst of that. But I do think that that's a place where there are a lot of really big premiums taken by OEMs. The technology piece I just want to touch on, you know, the narrow body airplane flying transatlantic is a huge innovation. You know, it started with the 757, but as technology evolves and the geared turbofan that Pratt & Whitney has manufactured, Louis Chenevert was really the genius behind the geared turbofan when Pratt lost all of its market share to GE. It's going to be a real innovation that is going to open up many more markets, longer haul markets to a narrow body airplane. And a narrow body airplane has such better economics in that long haul than a 2-aisle airplane. That innovation is going to be important, and the geared turbofan, very important. Let's see what else I can touch on here. Oh, just maybe this is just my pet peeve, but I wish we would be as transparent about taxes as we are about ancillary fees. I was actually involved in the TWA versus Morales case. Morales was the Attorney General of Texas and I was at Continental as a lawyer at the time, which is the advertising case and the preemption. And then DOT went about, making consolidation of all the taxes and fees, and they've grown precipitously. It's about 25%. Consumers pay about a 25% tax on a typical domestic ticket. Understand all the reasons behind that, but it ought to be just as transparent as all the ancillary fees.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.